Lecture by our distinguished guest, Professor Steve Fuller, who is the Auguste Comte Chair in Social Epistemology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick in England. Now, if you look at his resume, you can see that Professor Fuller is an extremely prolific writer. He's now the author of 21 books, literally hundreds of professional journal articles and book chapters, and his numerous writings have been translated into more than 20 languages. To name but a few of his many distinctions, he's a fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences, a fellow of the European Academy of Social Sciences, and a member of the science and technology platform EDGE, which has been described as the world's smartest think tank. I'm delighted that his lecture today is part of our Augustine and Culture Seminar, or ACS program, a series of events that means to engage students in intellectual and cultural dialogues that reach beyond the classroom. The topic of today's talk pertains directly to the overarching concern of the ACS program, which is the question of what it means to be human, but also what it will mean to be human as we move deeper into the 21st century. Now, to get a bit of a sense of the audience, can you please, how many of you are undergraduate students? Raise your hands. Okay, so you see this, the majority. How many of you are graduate students? How many of you are faculty? Anybody else? Okay. All right. Now, before I say a few more words about the speaker and the topic of his lecture, let me mention, for those who are new to this, the format of our event. First, Professor Fuller is going to talk for about 45 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have another 45 minutes for question and answers. Thus, I ask that you please do not run out of the lecture hall in a hurry as soon as Professor Fuller finishes his talk, because that's when the fun really starts, right? This is where you get a chance to interact directly with our speakers, ask him burning questions about Humanity 2.0, and perhaps even vigorously challenge his views. Let me also take a moment to thank the sponsors whose generous support has made this event possible, and that is the Ethics Program, the Department of Philosophy, and the Villanova Center for Liberal Education. I said in the beginning that Professor Fuller is the Auguste Comte Chair in Social Epistemology. And in fact, his chair was the world's first in social epistemology, which is a movement and research program which he founded in the 1980s. In this respect, it helps to know about his background that he did his PhD in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. So he's really trained both as a philosopher and a sociologist. In 1987, Steve Fuller launched the journal Social Epistemology and published the first of his 21 books with the same title in 1988. Now, if you look at the subtitle of the journal Social Epistemology, which is Knowledge, Culture, and Policy, you can see that the field is inherently interdisciplinary. The aim and scope of the journal, and I quote here, is to provide a forum for philosophical and social scientific inquiry that incorporates the work of scholars from a variety of disciplines who share a concern with the production, assessment, and validation of knowledge. The journal covers both empirical research into the origination and transmission of knowledge and normative considerations which arise as such research is implemented, serving as a guide for directing contemporary knowledge enterprises. Now, another significant facet of his intellectual autobiography is that he credits his academic supervisors at Pittsburgh for speaking comfortably of the continuities between theology and science throughout the modern period. These conversations, along with his original Jesuit training, especially in the philosophy of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, prepared him to take seriously the notion that there is scientific evidence of intelligent design in nature. As I'm sure many of you know, Professor Fuller has been a leading proponent of the theory of intelligent design and has authored several books on the subject. It is hardly surprising then that a central area of his research are the challenges which arise at the intersection between the natural and the social sciences, specifically the political and epistemological consequences of the new biology, such as biotechnology, genetic engineering, synthetic biology, or, as he once put it, as biology is shifting from being a spectator sport to a creative enterprise. Now, an upshot of these developments in biology is that our question of what it means to be human just got a little bit harder. Now, in response to these challenges, while defending the idea that there is a scientific basis to the concept of humanity, Professor Fuller has been developing his own version of transhumanism. Now, that is the idea that we could use technology to amplify or enhance human capabilities, in particular mental trademark capacities of our species, such as consciousness or rationality, with the possible result that we might turn into or evolve into another species, humanity 2.0, that would be an amplified or better version of what we are now. This project might be achieved through various modes of self-transformation or self-transcendence, including biological, hybrid biotechnological, or purely artificial technological means, such as mind uploading and those kinds of things. Now, what is distinctive and controversial, one might add, about Professor Fuller's conception of humanity 2.0 is his argument that the transhumanist project is in fact continuous with aspirations that are common to both Christian theology and modern science. In particular, he has argued that these aspirations are in fact traceable to the exceptional status of our species as having been created in the image and likeness of God, or imago Dei. Hence, the delightfully provocative title of his lecture today, Transhumanism as an Updated Version of Humanity's Divine Image. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Professor Steve Fuller.
Well, first of all, let me thank George for inviting me, and this is a very good forum for discussing these matters for a few reasons. One reason, of course, is that this being a Catholic university, this is a good place for discussing exactly the locus of this issue, and also the fact that we're doing this in a series that bears the name of St. Augustine, who is very often credited with having foregrounded the image and likeness of God thesis in Genesis. Okay, and so when one talks about how this thesis gets taken forward as somehow important in the history of Christianity and the history of science, one usually goes back to St. Augustine's commentary on Genesis for the beginning of that kind of discussion. But also, I think most of all, is the fact that most of the people in this room, including, I would say, some of the faculty members, are young people. And the kinds of issues that we're talking about here today are basically issues that people of the emerging generation are going to have to take forward in some way, not only at the level of philosophy, but I think more importantly at the level of politics and ethics. In a sense, we're just at the beginning of where we're going to be going with this idea of humanity 2.0. So without any further ado, let me just start by, it's an excellent introduction, by the way. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure it was captured on camera. Because in a sense I can refer to it as I'm speaking. And I think the first thing I want to start with, since George started with this, was this research program that I'm associated with, social epistemology. Those of you who've studied some philosophy know that epistemology is the theory of knowledge. And normally when we talk about this field, we're talking about what it is what counts as valid knowledge. So in other words, we're focused on the beliefs, on the knowledge claims, right? So we're focused on those things. You might say the products of knowledge. What we're usually not so much focused on is on who the knowers are. And this is where, in a sense, what the Humanity 2.0 project sort of turns the attention of social epistemology away from looking at what it is that we should believe, what sorts of claims do we know, but rather looks at who is this being who knows. Okay, and especially if we take knowledge, the point of inquiry and knowledge in a fairly robust way, as in some sense trying to get at the truth. Let's say we accept these sort of classical notions. What sort of a being does this? Okay. And obviously, historically, the answer was human beings. And of course, most of epistemology has been about the cognitive faculty faculties of human beings understood as humanity 1.0, so, recognizable features of the mind, understood in a relatively unenhanced sense, hence the possibility of getting fooled and deluded and all the rest of it, which is very much part of the stock of epistemological examples and counterexamples, right? We normally are operating with quite a fallible and finite understanding of the human mind. But what if we start to think in the terms that George was alluding to in the introduction of enhancement in some sense, that we can sort of expand beyond the natural cognitive capacities that we come with as biological creatures, okay? So this is kind of the starting point, you might say, for where Humanity 2.0 comes from this project of social epistemology. And one thing that also you should keep in the back of your mind as I'm talking about this is the fact that even if it is possible, and my view is it is possible, to enhance ourselves significantly, there will be a question on the table about what happens if, well, there are a few questions. One question is what happens if in our attempts to do this something goes wrong? There's that question. But then there's the other question of, let's say we are able to do this reasonably reliably, yet some people don't want to do it. Okay, so we've got these two questions on the horizon as well. Now, one of the reasons why I'm foregrounding these questions right now is because, again, in tune with this idea of social epistemology, we're talking about the community of knowers. Now, one of the things that I think historically has made the job of epistemology relatively easy in relation to where we are now is the fact that we've normally presumed that human beings have roughly, if not the same cognitive capacities, they are, as it were, complementarily limited, right? So in other words, so if you look at a lot of epistemology, there's a general view that human beings need to rely on each other, right? Depend on each other. Not everybody knows everything. So, people who specialize in certain areas know certain things more than others. And through some kind of division of labor and through some kind of coordinated effort among these various specialists, we come up with some kind of coherent body of knowledge that is of relevance to the society as a whole. And so our notions of expertise and stuff like this come from this general framework. Now, this kind of idea, which I think is still very much prevalent within epistemology, is a kind of, you might say, a background sociology of knowledge for epistemology, does go, you might say, in terms of where does this idea come from, I would say it goes back to the 17th century. It's very much, I see it as associated with the philosophy of John Locke, and as it were, the natural equality of humans. This is a word that you find very much in the Enlightenment, the idea of the natural equality of humans. So in other words, human beings are roughly the same. And this is why a lot of the kinds of differences that exist between human beings are generally seen as, from an epistemological standpoint and other standpoints, sort of unfair if they're used prejudicially, right? Because there's a sense in which people have roughly the same powers. Not exactly the same powers, but comparable and complementary. And together we can constitute a society. And the ideas surrounding a liberal society is based on those kinds of notions, a rough natural equality of people. It's a very powerful idea. Our notions of civil rights, human rights, are backed by this. It is fundamentally an empirical claim when it gets down to it. It's a claim about human beings and what they really are like. However, when we start talking about Humanity 2.0, and we talk about the possibilities for enhancement, we actually have a potential for that natural variation among human beings to become widened. Okay, so this is the thing on the table. Widened, not only because people will enhance themselves in various ways, but also because some people will refuse the enhancement. And in addition, and this is again a point never to be underestimated, we may make mistakes. Okay? And I have no doubt we will make mistakes. Let's put it this way. Okay? And as I imagine will happen, and we can have a little discussion about this once I finish speaking, I imagine that in fact our ethical guidelines that restrict research into the various biotechnologies on the horizon, they are going to be loosened in the years to come. This is my estimation. In other words, this is about as strict as they're going to get. They're going to become looser, which means there's going to be more opportunities for experimentation, and consequently there's going to be more opportunities for disasters to happen. And so the question is, what kind of a society can bear to live with this, and under what conditions, and what is its normative framework? So in other words, what I am imagining with regard to Humanity 2.0 is a form of human society that is going to have to countenance a much wider range of possibilities of the human condition than we have yet seen. And that the differences that we have spent the last 200 and 300 years fighting about, race, gender, all of these kinds of issues, class, they're going to seem relatively marginal in comparison to the things that are on the horizon in terms of differentiating people. And so this is kind of what I see, in terms of what the big picture looks like in the long term. And so there are a lot of issues that are opened up by this. But I do think that the first point to say about Humanity 2.0 is that, in a sense, the genie is out of the bottle. Okay? And there is no way of going back. This is why we should be dealing with these matters with open eyes, and we have to think about how to manage this ethically, politically, economically, and all the rest of it. And some of you may know, on Friday, just before I left to come over here, the New York Times had a feature story on genome editing. Okay, the idea that it is possible to edit the human genome with heritable effects. Okay, and the scientists who have been behind this are calling for a moratorium on the use of this technology until we've sorted the ethics and politics out. And if you delve into the story a little bit more, people feel that time is short for sorting this out because, as usual, and this is always sort of the thing on the horizon, the Chinese are already doing it, right? Ethics-free zone, China, okay? And so these issues, okay, are already here, right? And they're coming up in the newspapers every day, and we have to deal with them. And one answer that is not possible is no. That answer is, contrary to George W. Bush's ethics panel and Leon Cass, and those of you who followed that kind of activity 10 years ago, right, that prevented federally funded stem cell research, that option is really not on the table. It's going to have to be something else. It's going to have to be some kind of managed deployment of this technology. Okay? So this is kind of my starting point, at least with regard to Humanity 2.0. Now, one term that George mentioned in the introduction, which is very relevant to my point of view, is transhumanism. And what I want to say about that immediately is that it should be distinguished from posthumanism. And you may have run across one or another of these terms already. Here's a way to look at the difference. Because this is what, I think it's fair to say that one of the things that is continuous between the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the rise of modern science is this special status that is accorded to the human being with regard to the natural order. That human beings, in principle, have the capacity to understand all of reality, and in some sense, it is kind of our obligation to do so. This is quite an important point, and I think it's easy to underestimate this, because from a strictly evolutionary standpoint, in terms of the kind of knowledge that you actually need as a species to survive in the world, well, if you really took that idea seriously, you'd never be exploring the cosmos, you'd never be trying to radically reconstruct the Earth, you'd never be contemplating geoengineering as some people are now doing for sorting out the climate problems on the planet. You'd never do that, right? You would stick to the forms of knowledge that are adaptive given the normal conditions under which you survive. Right? So evolutionary accounts of knowledge tend to be about adaptive knowledge. Knowledge that enables you to live better in the environments in which you normally find yourself. And of course, this allows room for all kinds of innovations and things of that kind. But what it doesn't do is license this idea that we're somehow in a position to know everything. Right? That the cosmos is for us to figure out. Right? That to have an adequate theory of science is something that has to unify all the phenomena of nature under one neat cognitive package, a grand unified theory of everything. right? Only human beings have these kinds of delusions of grandeur, right? Other creatures do not have this, and human beings for most of human history did not have this. But it has to do with a certain kind of self-understanding of the kind of creature that we are, okay? And this is where the business about being created in the image and likeness of God becomes very important. Because human beings have to think about themselves in a certain way in order to imagine that trying to find out the origins of the universe, trying to find out how many years things have been around, how everything on earth connects up with everything in the heavens, how all that stuff hangs together, right, requires that you be a certain kind of creature to think that this is anything other than a hobby. Right? Because in fact, the most esteemed forms of knowledge are, in fact, the knowledges that aspire to these cosmic dimensions. And this is why when we talk about the great achievements of humanity in the course of science, we do talk about the physicists. Because they're the guys, starting with Newton, they're the guys who've been trying to put it all together. But the point is that this kind of knowledge that they come up with is not necessary for our species' survival. Right? From an evolutionary standpoint, it may even be seen as maladaptive if you think about the kinds of technologies and kinds of capacities that come about as a result of this enormous extension of our physical knowledge. And, nuclear energy, right? That is the Janus-faced kind of genie that you get, right? Enormous capacity for cheap, efficient energy on the one hand, enormous capacity to destroy the planet on the other. We got to this state in the history of humanity because we were in the business of trying to figure out how everything hangs together. Not just what was required to survive on Earth. Okay? So this kind of exceptional character of human beings, which as I say is continuous between the Abrahamic religions and modern science, right, is a very important thing. And the way to understand transhumanism in this context is basically as the next step in the argument. In other words, transhumanism basically validates this narrative that I've just told you about the human condition, right? Namely that in a sense, the history of humanity has been, in a way, getting to a more godlike state, and to put it the other way around, to increase the distance between ourselves and the rest of animal nature from which we came. Okay? So transhumanism is about making the difference between us and the apes that we evolved from bigger. Make that difference bigger. Now, of course, one doesn't hold this kind of view unless you believe that there's something quite central and valuable. And even though most people who call themselves transhumanists are atheists, there's no doubt about that, right? They think of themselves as atheists. Nevertheless, it's very hard to motivate the project, especially given the amount of risks that we have undertaken as a species and the amount of risks that we are going to be opening ourselves to in the future by pursuing this transhumanist course, unless you somehow believe that human beings are much smarter than the average species. Because knowing Darwin, we know what happens to species in the end. They just get extinct and they get replaced by new ones. Okay? But yet somehow, human beings are going to beat the odds. We're going to beat the odds somehow. Okay? And so it requires a very kind of special self-faith, you might say, in the human condition. And so even though most transhumanists would call themselves atheists, I really think that without the theological backdrop to this, the position really does not seem sufficiently motivated. It seems too risky otherwise from a strictly evolutionary standpoint. Okay? Now this is where I'm going to talk about posthumanism as a counterpoint. Because posthumanism, as the term indicates, is basically trying to move beyond the human as the locus of value in the world. Because there is a sense with the transhumanists and also this big project that I've been describing that goes from the Abrahamic faiths through modern science, that, as it were, if you want to talk about value and meaning in the universe, you're talking about something where human beings are very central. Okay? And, you know, George talked about earlier when I was a student and went to Regis High School in New York City, Jesuit high school. We were back in the late 70s, we were very much enthralled by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. You may know about him. He was basically in the business of saying that in a sense, evolution was, we were evolving into God in some kind of sense. Okay, so this is how he squared the circle. And I don't want to get into the fine points of this, but in any case, one of the things that is true about what he was saying and about all these transhumanists is that human beings are at the locus of value in the universe because of their divine heritage, whatever. But posthumanism denies this, right? Posthumanism, in fact, thinks that the reason why we have all the problems we have in the world, and one can point most immediately to environmental problems and the global warming crisis and all of this kind of stuff, is because we are too anthropocentric, right? Human beings think of themselves as too important. And as a result, we are willing to risk all of life or a large amount of life as it exists on the earth for the sake of human hubris. Okay? And so posthumanism basically operates, if you want to put it in a kind of in terms of a slogan, it's that all species are created equal. Okay? Human beings are not special. Every form of life has its own value, its own dignity that is appropriate to it. There is no hierarchy of value with regard to life. Life is to be valued in its diversity, in its plurality. Ideas of biodiversity are very closely associated with posthumanism. Now, human beings may have a role in this kind of picture, but it is perhaps a role as a caretaker, but certainly not in the role of some kind of divine or crypto-divine engineer who is going to re-engineer all the species and re-engineer nature so that it's in the image and likeness of humanity. Okay? So posthumanism is basically the exact opposite of transhumanism with regard to where it places value and meaning in the world. It displaces the human, and that the human does have value, but the human has value only as a form of life among other forms of life. It's not intrinsic to what the human being is in some kind of exclusive way. So the whole idea of human beings being created in the image and likeness of God, that has to be put to one side if you're a posthumanist. Okay? And so, not surprisingly, people who are posthumanist in terms of their religious orientation often find things like Buddhism and Hinduism much more conducive, right? Where human beings do not have a privileged place, but they're just part of a larger kind of pantheistic sort of nature-oriented religion. Okay? So I think that kind of distinction needs to be made clear. Now, it's interesting when you look at where the ideas of transhumanism come from. The term itself was coined in the 1950s by Julian Huxley. Now, I raise this point because, in a way, the questions about Darwin and evolution, they don't go away. They're very central here. Because one of the things that was very clear, and this was clear to Julian Huxley's grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, the man who was known as Darwin's bulldog, who had these important debates in the middle and late 19th century defending evolution in its first generation. And the Huxleys, a whole family of them, and of course Aldous Huxley of Brave New World fame was brother of Julian Huxley, and all of these Huxleys were very concerned about what the place of human beings are if you take seriously what Darwin says, namely that human beings are just one of a panoply of species that over millions or billions of years have been subject to the same forces of genetic variation and natural selection. And that the sort of lifespan of the average species understood in evolutionary terms should be pretty much what happens to human beings as well. We're here for a while, and then at some point the environment changes to such an extent that our capacities to adapt disappear and we become extinct. This is the ultimate prognosis from the Darwinian standpoint. There is nothing, in fact, special about human beings in this regard. The only thing that might be special is that we are later, relatively speaking, in the evolutionary history, but later does not imply better or a greater chance of survival. If anything, Darwin's tendency was to think that the sorts of efforts that people were taking, including efforts to improve medical care, to enable people to live longer and so forth, was actually setting ourselves up for more problems down the line in terms of population control and things of that kind. And of course, in the 20th century, there's been a lot of discussion about that kind of issue as well. Right? That in a sense we have, quote, artificially kept alive people, right? Making it difficult for survival to happen. And this is kind of generally Darwin's view, that nature, as it were, has its own kind of logic, and that human beings are never going to really be able to outwit this. What we can do, though, is to adapt to circumstances. And so if you want to, get a sense of Darwin's ethical horizons, I would say that the people you would look at would be the Epicureans. Okay? These are the people who are very much concerned in the ancient Greek world, right? They were known as what we would call therapeutic philosophers, right? They were philosophers who, in a sense, thought that what you do when you do philosophy is you don't come up with big systems, you don't try to solve the basic problems of knowledge or anything like that, but you basically come to a kind of self-understanding where you're one with the world. Right? So in other words, you do not stress out over things that you have no control over. Right? You get a certain kind of equanimity, a certain kind of calm that enables you to avoid the pains in life, the suffering in life that comes from thinking that you are able to do things that you in fact cannot do, to control things that you in fact cannot control. And this was, I would say, Darwin's general viewpoint with regard, if you want to derive an ethics out of evolution, it would be that, and the notion of adaptation is basically in that frame, right? So it is not a philosophy that is dedicated to progress, because one of the things about philosophies of progress, and this is where the Huxleys start to get very, because the Huxleys were very progressive people, right? They believed in science as progress and all this kind of stuff. Is that progress typically requires that you have to go through a certain amount of pain, a certain amount of cost, in order to achieve the greater good, right? So that you cannot, as it were, build the shining city unless you tear down the old houses, right? And if you look at the way this was being played out in the 19th century, whether we're talking about the Industrial Revolution or we're talking about imperialism, right? This is basically the idea: no pain, no gain. There is cost to progress all the time. You are disrupting, you are destroying at the same time that you're laying the foundations for a better tomorrow. And this is very much part of the progressive mentality. And Darwin would say this is just a delusion. This is a delusion, okay? So when we go back to the Huxleys, the Huxleys have to somehow come up with an answer that is compatible with Darwin's theory of evolution, but in some sense enables us to retain the idea of human exceptionalism. Because we're not going to be able to launch anything like transhumanism as a well-founded project unless we have some kind of reason to think that human beings are in some way more privileged than the other animals. That in some sense we can beat the odds against our survival. Okay? And this is the context in which Julian Huxley in the 1950s was coming up with the idea of transhumanism. And his idea is pretty simple in terms of conception. And it's basically this, namely that whereas every other creature obeys evolution, is subject to the forces of natural selection and genetic variation, and we are common to all the other species in this regard, our difference is we know evolution. We don't just obey it. We're not just a data point. We actually know the theory. We actually know the theory that generates the data points. And that second-order awareness, in other words, an awareness not simply of how to survive in nature, but knowing the principles by which nature operates, on the basis of which we then survive, right? That is the decisive difference that human beings have. We know evolution, the other creatures simply obey it. And that second-order understanding of evolution then puts us in a kind of privileged position. It does put us, at least epistemologically, outside of the system. We can think about the system from the outside, and we can conceptualize it. Now, Julian Huxley, who was, you may know, was actually one of the founders of what's called the evolutionary synthesis, the modern evolutionary synthesis, because if you know something about the history of modern biology, you'll know that Darwin was a great natural historian, and Origin of Species, gives you this great narrative of how natural selection works to create this kind of tree of life business that you get over millions of years. But what Darwin did not provide was any account of the genetic mechanisms, right, by which organisms not only reproduce themselves, but produce variation, on the basis of which then there is change taking place that constitutes evolution. This required modern genetics, and this field developed independently of Darwin, and it's only in the early 20th century they start being brought together. And Julian Huxley is part of the generation which in the 1920s started to put it all together so that it looks like the theory that we have today, the modern evolutionary synthesis, okay? Which is a theory not only about how life evolved on the planet, but is also a theory about how genes work in ways that you can see in the laboratory and potentially alter through experimental intervention. Okay? And this is an important part of the story, because Huxley was one of the people who believed in eugenics. Okay? Which, by the way, Darwin did not believe. Because Darwin thought this idea, which his cousin Francis Galton was promoting, was an example of hubris, of this kind of hubris that Darwin thought would eventually lead human beings into more misery than they already have. Okay? But Darwin, of course, said this before we really knew much about genetics. I think that's a point that needs to be made clear here, and that most of the knowledge that we do have of genetics comes from the early 20th century onward, and in fact, around the period Julian Huxley is writing, we're on the verge already of the molecular revolution in genetics, and of course this opens the door to the kinds of things that we see today with biotechnology. So this is a whole world quite different from the way Darwin was thinking about things, and it would indeed be interesting to think what Darwin would make of what he saw if he were alive now, what he would make of what's going on in the genetics labs of the world today. However, it's fair to say that Huxley was pretty optimistic. Julian Huxley was pretty optimistic. And he thought that, in fact, given that we understand how evolution works, given how we are probing into the way in which genes work, we are actually going to be able to intervene and direct and to steer in very substantial ways the way in which evolution proceeds in the future. Now, of course, Huxley is saying all this less than 10 years after the end of World War II and the Nuremberg trials and all of these kinds of events that, in fact, set the benchmarks for the rather strict ethical guidelines that we currently have on human subjects research. Right? Because this was the Nuremberg trials when all the Nazi doctors came up and all these crimes against humanity were revealed in the courtroom. And a lot of our ethics codes for research come out of an awareness of this. But nevertheless, Huxley is writing this stuff in the 1950s because he believed that, there's a sense in which we have to think about World War II as an unfortunate blip. In other words, World War II, was bad. The Nazis were bad. The scientists didn't stand up. But in terms of where the science is going, the capacities that are being opened up, in a way, I think Huxley's attitude toward eugenics was very much like the people who say, well, look, yes, we dropped the atomic bomb. It was the most powerful and most deadly weapon ever used by humanity, but that doesn't kill nuclear energy. Okay? But nevertheless, it does raise some important, interesting normative issues as we go forward. So transhumanism gets coined with this understanding that human beings, at a kind of epistemological level, know how evolution works and are unique in knowing how evolution works. And this gives us a certain kind of responsibility and maybe even obligation to direct the process. And then the question becomes, how do we direct the process? Okay? And there Huxley didn't have very profound answers. And the issue, of course, is complicated by the fact that we're talking about this kind of knowledge as, you might say, something that's collectively owned by all of humanity. So we're not just talking about something that is just the possession of a few experts who happen to know how genetics work, but it's something that's potentially that everyone would in some sense participate in deciding the outcome. Okay? I think one thing, though, that is very interesting about the way Huxley approached this matter, and I don't want to spend too much time on him because obviously he's a man who, just as we are, is limited by the kinds of things that one could know in the middle of the 20th century. But he was very clear about one thing, and that was that we should not reify biological differences. Okay? I don't know how you people think about eugenics. But I think the way not to think about eugenics is as an ordinary form of racism. Because racism historically has a lot to do with the idea that there's some kind of natural bases that separate out different groups of people because of where they came from, etc. And those things are in some sense unchangeable, immutable. Okay? Eugenics doesn't operate with this framework. Eugenics actually operates with the exact opposite framework, namely that whatever we are born with, it is changeable. Okay? And this is why eugenics historically was associated, and again, put Nazi Germany to one side, but in terms of the politics of eugenics, has been mostly associated with progressive movements. Indeed, in the United States, if you want to look at where the politics of eugenics was in the early 20th century, you look at the progressive movement in the United States. The people who we associate with Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, those guys, the Progressive Party, those were the people who were supporting eugenics. It was seen as a progressive movement because the idea was our biology is not fixed. Human nature is not fixed. It can be changed. And the more and more we learn about genetics, the more and more we'll be able to do this. At first we start very crudely. And the crude way of doing eugenics, as you probably all know, has to do with restricting births. Right? That's the crude way, and that goes from a period where we don't know much about genetics. But as we learn more about genetics, we can intervene in finer and finer grained detail, we can study the consequences much more closely, and we can then revise our practices accordingly. And this is the idea that Julian Huxley had in mind with regard to transhumanism, right? That it would be this more and more refined version of eugenics. And if you look at the things that we do today with regard to antenatal screening, gene therapy, all of these kinds of things that are very much already here, this is the downstream effects of more sophisticated forms of eugenic thinking. The word eugenics, I realize, is very bad from a PR standpoint because of all the historical associations. But it is basically, this is what we're talking about here. Okay? But it requires, but the point that I wanted to stress is all along, the idea is that the human nature is changeable by design. And this is where the complications come in, by design. Because this is where people start to get very upset and say, my God, are we going to have a super race and all the rest of it? And I think this is an issue that, from the history of eugenics, has dogged the history of eugenics. And I think in a way there's a version of this problem that is still very much with us, namely the possibility, if we have a kind of relatively unregulated bio-regime, right, where we loosen the ethical restrictions and people who are able to spend the money to be able to intervene in various ways in their own genome are able to do so freely, and the rest of the population is in some sense left behind. So there is this way in which the kinds of inequalities that already exist in our society, with, even before we get into issues of genetic manipulation, can in fact be exacerbated if it is made possible that people who are wealthier and know more about what's going on are able to in fact intervene genetically in the ways that others cannot. And I think this issue, I come from Britain, and it's we have welfare state in Britain still, and we have a National Health Service, and there it's a very important issue because part of what a National Health Service is supposed to do is to be able to guarantee a certain standard level of medical care to everyone, and so then the question becomes, what is the standard? Right? And if it turns out that certain elements of the population are able to get a genetic advantage through some kind of interventions, okay, then do we then need to raise everybody to that standard? You see what I mean? There are all these kinds of issues that start to arise here. And I do think that that is going to be something very much on the horizon. We're going to have to, because what's being challenged here is how do we stabilize a norm for the human condition? How do we stabilize a norm? And one of the great things about the welfare state is that through their national health care systems, it has been possible in the 20th century to provide some kind of understanding of what it means to live a normal, decent life in terms of life expectancy, in terms of quality of life, and that kind of thing can be monitored by the state and where necessary administered by the state. This is certainly the case in Europe. But with the kind of thing that we're talking about here, where it's possible for people to intervene in various ways to change their life conditions radically, this idea of a norm can be very difficult to maintain under the circumstances. Okay? So that's one issue on the table. But the issue that I would like to point to you as actually more substantial, and I've been alluding to this throughout the talk, is the issue of risk. Because what I've been saying now with regard to the eugenics stuff and that eugenics side of transhumanism has basically had to do with the prospect that some people might be in a position to intervene in their genome, create certain kinds of advantages that then put them in some sort of permanent superior position to other people in society. That scenario presupposes it works, and it works to plan. That those interventions do exactly what they're supposed to do without unintended consequences. Okay? Now here's the tricky part, of course, because when we're talking about genetic interventions, even if we know that there's a particular place on the genome that is hooked up to something that we're interested in changing, there are all sorts of ripple effects in the genome that take place. So you're not just changing one thing, you're changing lots of things at once. Okay? And that is very difficult to be able to anticipate what the consequences are, given that everyone is slightly different. Okay? So there is a risk factor here of an enormous amount, where we just really don't know the consequences. So even if the thing does work to plan in the sense we want, there may be side effects that are undesirable and undermine or undercut the advantages that we're talking about. This is certainly, until we understand how the genome works more clearly, we're going to have to expect this, and frankly, we're not going to understand how the genome works more clearly unless we take the risks. I think there's really no replacement for this. This is the other point, okay? That in a sense, if we really want to find out what the consequences are of all these genetic interventions, we're going to have to do them. Which means we are opening ourselves up to greater risk than ever before with regard to the kinds of lives that will be in our midst. And so that means what kind of society can tolerate that. Okay? Now, one of my most recent books is called The Proactionary Imperative. And there I actually talk about what kind of society we're getting ourselves into here. Because this is going to be a society where we're going to have to first assume a much greater level of risk. And what does that mean, to assume a greater level of risk? Well, it means that first of all, we cannot be afraid of it. But at the same time, we have to have sensible, you might say, insurance policies. Think about the ways in which we deal with risk normally. There has to be insurance policies, and there has to be compensation when things go wrong. And this has to be done at a socialized level. So one of the things that I talk about in the proactionary imperative is that if we're going to be moving into a transhumanist society, where we are going to be making these interventions that have all these risky consequences, obviously not everyone is going to want to do this. In fact, most people perhaps will not want to do this, even if we loosen the ethical restrictions and so forth. But let's say 10 or 20% of the population wants to do this. Okay. My view is that even if these things go wrong, nevertheless we will learn something from it. There will be knowledge gained from this. Right? There's a sense in which all the failures are sources of new knowledge. And so those people who have put themselves at risk in this fashion are in fact benefiting society as a whole. And what that means is that the rest of society that is not taking the risks ought to be subsidizing them. Okay? In other words, the people not taking the risks subsidize the risk takers because everybody learns from what happens. Okay? We are going to get more knowledge from this, and we'll be able then to improve our practices, improve our research, and everything of that kind. Okay? So this is part of the kind of, because what I'm envisaging here is a kind of socialized, it is a kind of welfare state, but it's a welfare state where what we're talking about here, where people are encouraged, right, to take the kinds of risks that are needed in order to see just how far we can go in enhancing the human condition. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a way of ensuring and compensating for it when things go wrong. And this is, and one of the consequences of this, I would say, is that it means that everybody's kind of in it together. Because I do take very seriously the idea that if you just allow people to experiment and then, as it were, absorb the consequences for themselves, whether they're positive or they're negative, what you're going to end up getting is a very fragmented and very divided society, and maybe even a very stratified society, kind of the worst nightmare of the people who are against eugenics. But here what I'm talking about is socializing the risk, okay? By having those who do not take the risk subsidize those who do, and in return, there is public availability and access to the knowledge that we produce in this fashion. And this is part of a more general program that I think is going to be very important if we take this transhumanist position on board in the future. And that is that people have to see themselves much more explicitly as scientific citizens. Okay? And what I mean by that, and I will end here, is that I think at the moment, and I do think this is where I think some of the ethical restrictions on research creates, I think, a public relations problem with science, is that people, I think, are very used to thinking about scientists as somehow dangerous, right? Scientists are doing all these crazy things. I don't want to get involved, right? Save me from them, okay? I think this is a big mistake. Nevertheless, I do think there is this kind of dichotomy set up. But what I do think would be much better would be that that people come to see science as something that they are entitled to participate in and have a say in. Okay? And I mean that more than just at the level of what kind of research is permitted, but rather in terms of participating, being participants in the research themselves. In fact, one of the things that I suggest in the proactionary imperative is that people should be allowed to serve in scientific experiments in the way in which, as let's say, a form of national service, right? So instead of going into the army, which a lot of countries still have, right, national service for a certain fixed period of time when you're young, right, that you in fact participate in scientific research, and that would be part of national service instead, okay? In other words, to ensure that people are co-owners of scientific knowledge and scientific research as we move forward. But I think that there is no denying, and I'll end here, that the kind of world that we're talking about with transhumanism is one that has to accept and understand that we're going to be opening ourselves to greater risks as we expand the frontiers of knowledge. And, for me, I talk about proactionary, which is a term that the transhumanists use to describe this position I'm endorsing. The opposite position you may be familiar with if you follow the environmental debates is precautionary. Okay? The precautionary principle is actually inscribed in European law with regard to health and environmental policy. So as you know, genetically modified organisms have been very difficult to get through in European Union policy, largely through the precautionary principle, namely that if you cannot ensure there will be no harm from the innovation, you don't introduce it. Right? So in other words, you want to minimize harm as much as possible. That's your overriding value with the precautionary principle. And my point about that is, despite the sort of superficial attractiveness of that idea, if we in fact lived by the precautionary principle over the last 300 years, we would have never made the kind of progress in science that we have in fact made. Because the progress that we have made in science has come from taking an enormous amount of risks, often risks based on ignorance. In other words, we didn't realize just how much of a risk we were taking, But nevertheless, being open to risks has been very important in terms of the great leaps in knowledge that have been made in the past. And now I think, because of some of the unfortunate precedents that have happened in history, in the 20th century in particular, there is a tendency to shy away from that, to pull back from that, and to become more precautionary, to be risk-averse, essentially. And I think that in the end of the day, yes, we could become more precautionary, and we can become much more adaptive with our environment, and we can become much more like creatures that Darwin said we ought to be. That's all possible. In any case, I think this is going to be the big political battle that will be on the horizon over the course of most of your lifetimes. There will be people arguing that we actually need to be open to more risk, to be more proactionary, to try to increase the difference between ourselves and our animal origins. And there will be others who think that this is completely foolhardy, and what we need to do is we need to return to our roots in nature and to go back to our animal origins and to live in a world that is more in equilibrium with nature. And it seems to me that's going to be the political divide that's going to be facing us in the 21st century. It's one that is between the transhumanists on the one hand and the posthumanists on the other with regard to how to take humanity 2.0. And I'll stop here and take questions from the audience. Thank you for your attention. Questions? Oh, loads. Okay.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to try to channel it into just one. So the way that you're articulating eugenics as the changeability of human nature, this is problematic for me because it still presumes that we somehow know what's better or worse to be the case for human nature and human condition. And it's not just a problem of some people being left behind, it's stabilizing a new norm. Who or what dictates the new norm, and what values does this norm presume? I'm aware that in your, maybe this isn't the way that you think anymore, but at one point you were committed to the view that just because the humanists, like the liberal humanism that started in the 18th century, isn't done, doesn't mean that we should just leave it behind. So in what ways does this channel both of those?
Well, what my view is that we need to take, because the great thing about the 18th century liberal idea was that it was based on a tolerance of diversity, but that was kind of easier to do back then because the kind of diversity we were talking about was not as large as what we're contemplating now. So that's where I think the challenge comes in. I mean, I don't know if you follow any of this transhumanist literature, there are some transhumanists who believe that we are going to get to a point where we can't tolerate the diversity and there's going to be subspeciation. Okay? So in other words, all of these different interventions that people might be doing, they will end up leading to different species descending from humanity. I think that would be a big mistake, myself. I think that would be a big loss. But I think that is the issue. So the issue is, it's still the liberal issue. It's the issue, how can you have a tolerant liberal society that is able to encompass differences only now where we're talking about a much wider range of differences. But also these are differences, I think, maybe more changeable than they were in the past. That's the other thing too. So in other words, there may be more, people may end up having more flexibility. I mean, I'll give you one example. There are people talking about the idea of flipping genders over the course of their lifetimes, right? So you can flip genders, So I mean, but that then does sort of change issues a lot in the society, how we think about things. But I'm still committed to those ideas of, tolerating diversity. I just think what happens with this is that you open up the door to a much wider range. Okay. I mean, do you think that there's something permanent that we ought to be focusing on with regard to human beings?
I mean, I'm more concerned with the who or what says where we should. Well,
it's a political issue. I mean, Julian Huxley was very much involved with the construction of the UNESCO Statement on Race in 1950. This is a very famous document which basically declared that race was a social construction. Okay, this idea that race doesn't really exist in biology. He was behind that, okay, and that was the UNESCO Statement on Race. He was saying this from the standpoint of thinking that race is literally socially constructed. In other words, if you don't allow certain people to interbreed in a certain way, right, and if you do allow people to interbreed, you get different segregations of people. So in that sense, race is socially constructed. Doesn't mean it doesn't. So in other words, it exists as a social construction. So the important question then becomes, who's making the decisions about how people breed, right? And that's a political decision. That's not a biological decision. And so maybe we're in agreement. I believe this is ultimately politics. This is ultimately about who's on the table making the decisions and how people are being represented in the process of the decision making. That's what it boils down to. But the biology itself is kind of an open game. Okay, so we may be in agreement on this point. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. You certainly, are very clear and enthusiastic, and have a lot to go on. I guess I'm going to, in some way, follow up on Kat's excellent question with a not as well-worded question of my own. I have a bit of a trouble with what this dichotomy that you're making between, or that you're saying between transhumanism and posthumanism. Because on the one side, you seem to claim that transhumanism is on the side of science, and therefore on the side of like what real humanity is, which is science and knowledge in the form of the best kind of knowledge is mathematics and physics and things like that, and therefore that's the best kind of what is human. And posthumanism, which is, humans are only animals, and they want to just go back to nature. And that, of course, is not a good description of what posthumanism is, and what this idea of going back to nature. The fact that humans are animals that live not only in society, but in a world that is natural, that we are living nature. This building that we're in is a part of the nature that we've constructed, yes, but we're never outside of nature. So how is it that, so could you please maybe give me a better description of what you mean by posthumanism, and maybe some figures that you're talking about specifically? Because I'm a little confused as what you mean, because you seem to be saying that, the best thing is to be transhuman, to go beyond our biological condition, but do you not have a conception of human as being in nature, as having a relationship with nature?
Well, I think a transhumanist denies that nature has an essence to it, right? I mean, if you had to give a sense of how a transhumanist sees nature, it's basically capital. Okay? I mean, I think that would be the raw material. Right? Yes, in that sense, yes, we're there. Our bodies are raw material, right? A transhumanist would say, Homo sapiens, the biological body in which we come, is raw material that can be improved, right? Can be transformed, may at some point be superseded if we upload our consciousness, right? Some of the transhumanists haven't talked much about that, but there's that on the table too, right? So there's a sense in which if what you mean by nature is simply the material world, transhumanists certainly don't deny that. But what they do deny is the idea that nature has some kind of intrinsic essence or contains a value that sets an implicit norm to the appropriateness of our activities. That is what transhumanism denies, okay? And posthumanists, on the other hand, I would say, do believe that at some level, and I take your point, I was being a little too quick in saying that the posthumanists are anti-science. They are not anti-science. They are not anti-science, for sure. But they emphasize different sciences, and they draw different lessons from the history of science. Because after all, in order to have a precautionary attitude toward nature, you have to be able to assess probabilities just as much as the other guys do. Right? And you're just making different judgments on the basis of trying to understand risk factors. Both are equally scientific. You are absolutely right on that score. It's just different conclusions that are drawn. Okay? And I think with the precautionary stance, there is a belief that nature has a kind of norm. Right? It has an inherent norm, and if we go beyond that, it's going to lead to disaster. And I think a transhumanist basically denies this. I think that's where the difference is. But both are based on science, sure. I mean, if you look at the global warming stuff, right? Of course, the global warming stuff is based on science, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. So I didn't mean to make the posthumanists seem anti-science. No, it's just they draw a different kind of conclusion from how we read the science. But it is an issue. There is an issue about the normative character of nature. Does nature have its own normative character, or is it just raw material which acquires its normative character from what we do with it? That's really what the difference is between the two positions. You want to follow up? Yeah.
Yeah, follow up really quickly. So, one thing that one thing in particular that's very interesting is that you make the distinction between the atheist transhumanists and the religious transhumanists. And as George knows, that I'm really into Augustine's commentaries on Genesis. That's I'm really into that stuff. So you put the image of God or the humans made in the likeness of God as a kind of foundational principle, or just a principle that is necessary to make sense of this project. What kind of image is that? If you seem to be saying that, well, it's not material, right? It's not in the material image. It's not our bodies. It doesn't seem to be really of our knowledge. It seems maybe something like knowledge. But if we're made in the image and likeness of God, why would it be necessary to make ourselves more into the image and likeness of God? Doesn't that require a particular conception of God? Where are you getting at the
okay, well, I could go in and say, okay. My own thinking on this is very much influenced by John Duns Scotus, okay? He is, in terms of the history of scholastic theology, he's very much the person involved with the idea of univocal predication. So when we're reading the Bible, right, when attributions are made of God, right, the words that are being used, like God is all good, all knowing, all powerful, all this kind of stuff, right, the use of the words good, knowing, powerful mean exactly the same thing as they do when attributed to human beings, except that God has it to an infinite degree. Okay? And so, in other words, there is a sense in which one can make a kind of continuum comparison. But there's a tricky part to this, and that is, of course, because God has all of these virtues. When you have all these virtues to the infinite extent as God does, they all converge. And so you have a unified, simple God in that respect. But of course, in human beings, all of these virtues are quite differently manifested. People who are very smart aren't necessarily very good, and so forth. And so to imagine all of these virtues converging together in an infinite sense is to actually imagine a being that's really quite different from what human beings are. Right? Because we can imagine, as it were, what is the infinitely best calculator? What is the infinitely, best this, best that? Okay, but we understand them just as single dimensions. What is very hard to understand is what it looks like if all those dimensions converged on one being. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, in a sense. This is what the knowledge of God is about. And I take it that that's kind of the how one gets to the image and likeness of God. The precedent for this kind of thinking, by the way, before, it's in the Franciscan tradition. The person to look at would be St. Bonaventure, right? The mind's journey to God. And that's where we start to get this image of getting into the mind of God, which becomes very much part of what physicists try to do in the modern period, right? That comes from St. Bonaventure. And I think it's that tradition coming from the Franciscan scholastic tradition that you start to get some clear notion of how you actually get to that state of perfecting being in the image and likeness of God.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ryan?
Okay, so going in, look at that. The biologist and worried a little bit about genetic variation. So as you converge onto this one being, every person becomes human, we're reducing the genome's heterozygosity, which can lead to essentially one superbug, like an actual species. And we see that especially with genome editing. If we keep editing out diseases and editing it out, so for example, malaria, we introduce heterozygous advantage by having a sickle cell gene. How do you account for that within transhumanism?
Well, no, this is a good point. So what you don't want is premature convergence, right? This is kind of what you're suggesting, it seems to me. Yeah, so we shouldn't presume that we're almost there and that we know what we need to edit out and so forth. In fact, interesting, I don't know if you're familiar with I'm going to put a name up here. Do you know Theodosius Dobzhansky? Have you heard of him? I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He was along with Huxley, he was one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis. And he actually believed that he actually thought there might be some positive effects by trying to increase variation through radiation. Okay? And then see what kinds of different sorts of organisms and possibilities emerge from them. And that would, in fact, enhance the evolutionary condition, okay? So people have taken quite different views on these matters. So I don't think one should think that one should be aiming for a premature convergence. I think that leads to, in a sense, some of the nightmares of eugenics that people have been worried about, right? Because that's kind of what the people who worry about eugenics worry about, and stuff like that. Yeah. But it's a very open question, it seems to me. Yeah. Also got this guy.
More people.
Yeah, sure. Just to talk at the biodiversity as well. In sometimes, and if the image of God is a singular ideal, even if it's very complex and to the extent that we can't even conceive of it, would that not also coming to somewhat convergence, even if it's later, within ecology, the idea of monocultures and things like that creating problems even within the beginning of American society, already having some genetic modifications, even though it wasn't directly directed, would not the taking away of the potential ability to have variation cause problems, not just within the human sense, as a super white people out, but causing the issue of having biodiversity as a check against catastrophic events, as in if we move things too quickly, we won't have enough time to coalesce into a larger ecosystem or biosphere, whereby things can blow up very quickly. And I guess that's my concern.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. Look, I'm not arguing for premature convergence. I didn't say convergence was going to happen next week or anything, okay? So don't worry about that. I also do think that given that we are still at a pretty early stage with regard to our knowledge of genetic intervention, the likelihood is even if we are trying to create convergence, we're going to generate all kinds of side effects that we haven't yet anticipated. So I don't think, you see what I mean? I mean, I think our knowledge is sufficiently imperfect that even if we were trying to get convergence, we probably wouldn't get it. That's my view. But the point, the thing I guess I do take some positive feeling from is the fact that we're able to talk about this sensibly, right? That this is something we can actually get engaged in some way, right? And rather than, because what I worry about is that this whole discussion could get shut down. That all issues regarding genetic editing, for example, would be closed. I mean, I worry about that sometimes.
Just to
Sure.
We've already had some, which I think to allay some fears, we've already done it unintentionally, especially within agriculture.
Sure, no, I agree.
And I think that does give me at least some hope in mitigating that show. Well, what disaster could happen if we did that? We've already done it unintentionally within many families.
I agree with you 100%. If you look at the way in which the genetically modified organisms debate took place in Europe in the 1990s, okay, where people were making exactly the argument you were making, but nevertheless fear dominated the whole discussion. Okay, and this is why you should look at it. It's very difficult. People do think that somehow, they forget about the whole history of agriculture and how it's always involved our intervening in various ways. They forget this. You see, so I don't think this. I mean, I'm glad that we're talking about this quite sensibly, but there are people who really worry about the risks. More than the people in this room seem to be, which I'm grateful for.
Let's see, one more from we're going to try to balance out graduates and undergraduates.
Okay.
So one thing that seems at the center of this whole debate for me is this idea of will, because this would be the first time in the history of evolution that a species has sort of willed its next level collectively in a sense.
Yes.
And so I'd kind of like to hear how you would respond to, because in this entire sense of transhumanism and enhancement, there's this sense that we will, improve that over which we have the power to improve. Obviously, that's kind of just a fact of science. So what if the things about being human that are actually highest, the things we would want to most sort of enhance, are things which we fundamentally don't have power over? And I'm bringing in here a sense of a God as an active will in the world, grace that sort of fills the human person. Most importantly, love and the ability to suspend will and power. What if the real problem with transhumanism is that we diminish that reality, or at least, make ourselves more capable of ignoring that reality of the human person, and thus we become actually less human?
I think that's a really good point, actually. But it's interesting because my inclination is that these are genuine concerns. And where I would like to see you take this kind of concern is to the people who work on artificial intelligence in terms of how they design machines that are in some way trying to simulate human beings, and what kinds of things do you want this machine to do to be able to impress human beings? Because part of the transhumanist dynamic is the possibility that artificial intelligences, which are able to simulate key features of the human condition, might be accorded some level of personhood. Right? Especially if we start imagining that being a human being doesn't require that you stay within your biological body at birth, and we start to imagine cyborgs and people in some way hybridizing themselves, then why can't we have artificial intelligences pass as persons if they meet certain kinds of Turing test style requirements? Well, so you might want in the Turing test to include, how do you test for the capacity for love, for the capacity to suspend will? How do you test for that kind of thing in a being? You see, so it'd be interesting to bring those kinds of concerns to those guys, because I think it needs to be made part of the conversation. I mean, and I think you're right in saying that the kind of people who do take the transhumanist concerns forward don't tend to think about these things, right? And this is where I think there's a sort of, because this is an ignorance of the theological tradition, I think, and this is where I think the transhumanists actually knew a little bit more about theology and had a kind of more rounded conception about the nature of God and God's relation to humans and so forth, rather than just a purely kind of intellectualist view of God as a supreme norm, which I think is the one that's really dominant in transhumanism. But this is what I would say. I'd say take those concerns to the people who are designing artificial intelligence and think about, well, how would you design a machine that actually has those capacities? I don't think it's impossible, but I think you have to actually get people to apply their thinking this way. Okay? I mean, so I am sympathetic with your concern, okay? I don't think it's adequately addressed at the moment. That's my point.
What's it going? Ian or Chris? Flip the coin.
So I have a little trouble with this idea of rest when you start talking about rest, because the way I understand the way you're talking about this in the beginning is that we can basically become closer to God, we can become, enhance our human capabilities through science and technology. But then when you get to rest, it seems like you're talking about only the risk of, at one point you say, we don't want to get to a point where a bunch of rich people can modify themselves genetically and the rest of the population is left behind.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in other developments in science and technology, has that not happened, right? I mean, it's not like everybody in the world has internet access or smartphones or access to all of these things that we think, commonly by your understanding, as I understand it, we would be able to say it enhances the human capability, right? Because it makes us more able to do certain things. So I'm wondering if there's a normative commitment in your work somewhere, because I've been looking for it as I read Humanity 2.0, a normative commitment that gets us away from the ways in which this is already happening, that this risk is there's already a rift that's being created between people who have structural access to these sorts of things and people who don't. Is there any way that is going to go away, or, because the one thing that we know about risk and rewards is that one group tends to get the rewards and another group tends to be...
Well, no, but this is why I want to socialize the risks. I think that the kind of world that we're opening ourselves into now involves the potential for a greater variation than we have seen before, okay? And so we need, because what I'm imagining is that there will be a lot of experimentation where maybe rich people take the risks initially, but we don't know what the consequences are, and we have to kind of live with the consequences together. So I'm for a kind of socializing of the risk. And you're right, in the past it hasn't been done, but that's not a reason for it, not to be done now. Okay?
But even on a global level, I mean, that doesn't address it, right? Because the theological component, I think the real harm is that we see people who have these modifications as being closer to God or something, and then it's impossible. We don't have a structure by which we can socialize something on a global scale, right? Yeah. So it's not like we're going to be able to make people in sweatshops have more RAM in their head before, at the same time as we get more RAM in our head. So that's the real danger, I think, is that there's a theological component to this where we're getting closer to God, and a group is being left out automatically because you can't socialize on that level.
Well, I mean, I actually think I mean, I do think it isn't crazy for welfare states that have national health systems to actually think about the issues like smart drugs and stuff like that as something generally available to a population if it's going to enable people to actually boost their productivity or become better in some way or another. I don't think there's anything. I mean, I think that's the level at which you have to address. Because I do think when we're talking about transforming the human being in terms of the physical body, that then you're talking about something that, in a way, is very directly relevant to a welfare and healthcare system. That's what I would have thought from a societal standpoint. You're right. There have been these inequalities that have been produced and even exacerbated through new technologies. There's no doubt about that. But the fact that that's happened doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing something in this respect. So in other words, I mean, it almost sounds like you're giving me a counsel of despair here.
I'm just wondering if where the normative commitment is in your vision of transhumanism that would try to avoid things like this, because I can't find it.
Well, look, what you can't avoid is that there's going to be a variation among people. What you can do, you can't avoid that problem. But what you can do is somehow mitigate the risks that are taken and compensate for them when they go badly, okay? And this is part of what I was saying in terms of the risk takers being subsidized by the non-risk takers. And I would also, I might want to put a limit on what wealthy people can do with their money with regard to this stuff, okay? I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities that one could be working on here. But since a lot of this research that we're talking about isn't really fully legal yet, I mean, there's a lot of, we can actually, as it were, deal with this from the basic level. Because it's not that this stuff is already out there and we have to somehow control something that's taking place. A lot of this stuff isn't really happening yet. So it's early enough now to actually set in some regulations and some principles. Okay, I mean...
Okay, we have 3 more minutes, so we have maybe time for 2 questions. Keep the questions short, the answers short. Tyler, and then you.
So, as a psychology major, I'm really interested in your thoughts on risk and IRB.
Okay.
Watch some of your lectures on those. A little weary of using the fact that China's progressing quicker than we are in terms of like technological and genetic modification as a justification for exposing the first guinea pigs of this movement to extreme forms of personal risk. And I do believe that in order to move forward, we need to take on a little more risk, and that institutional boards like IRB can be a little more lenient. But at what point does the risk to the individual become so potentially destructive that the benefits to science don't outweigh the...
I actually don't think there's a principled answer to that question. I think what we should be moving toward, though, is a kind of personal contract arrangement, okay, where people are, and maybe people will need to have lawyers or something involved, but where there is some kind of agreement between the scientist and the subject about what the nature of the risks are, that the person understands what the nature of the risks are. And different people will have different risk thresholds, frankly, okay? And I actually think that's a good thing. So in other words, I wouldn't give a principled answer to the question. But I do think the interesting question is, what kind of information do people need to have in order to make an informed decision? Okay, I think that's kind of the question. And also, what counts as adequate compensation should things go wrong? And I think that always has to be very much in the forefront of these kinds of discussions, is that the possibility that things may go wrong, and there has to be compensation and who's paying for it, okay? And so this, I mean, so in other words, whatever's going to happen here with regard to transhumanism, it's going to be a bonanza for lawyers. No, I'm serious. I mean, I think lawyers are going to have a field day with this, because there is a lot to think about with regard to insurance and compensation. If we have, what I believe is sort of different people taking different levels of risk, rather than having just one standard across the board.
Last question.
Just to go back to the theological version, so would you say that transhumanism collapses the distinction between obedience and radical disobedience, which many think is the whole point of the first 3 chapters of Genesis?
Well, it depends what you mean by obedience exactly. I mean, does obedience mean submission?
Well,
think so.
to an extent, I think
Well, see, I don't think obedience implies submission. And so I don't.
Well, obedience to the commands of God, let's say.
Yes,
So, I mean,
obedience to the commands of God may endorse transhumanism. I mean, at least I don't see it as required. I mean, this is where I think Christianity and Islam are a bit different. Okay, I think Islam actually has a much stronger sense of submission to God than Christianity does. Okay, but that would take us in a whole different direction. I think Christianity actually has a very affirmative.
Leave submission out of it. And so we're made in the image of God.
Right.
And this means that we should strive to be like gods, which is the language of the serpent in Genesis 3. And those seem to come together in transhumanism.
Well, I do think there are subtleties here, no doubt about it. Okay, I'm not saying this is so straightforward. I mean, there's a story of Faust and all the rest of it. Yes. And I've actually written about that, the whole transgressive side of all this. Yes, I understand that. But in a sense, the thing about the serpent is very close to being right. Right? And the difference between right and wrong is actually quite close there. And that's the thing we have to negotiate. Okay? But I don't see submission as part of the obedience line. I don't. Let's put it this way. Again, it depends what you think the relationship is between theology and science. But if you believe, as I do, and I think the people in the scientific revolution do, that in a sense, modern science is a kind of outgrowth of Christian theology, okay? A kind of realization, not the only realization, but a kind of realization of it, then you have to have a much more affirmative view about what obedience to God means. I mean,
Thank you.
yeah.
I think I'm going to have to stop here. Thank you.